grew up inside a place that felt like the edge of the world. Though looking back now, it was really nothing more than a sleepy patch of suburbs in the southwestern United States. Not quite desert, but not entirely fertile either. It was this strange middle ground where the summers were brutal and the winters were pretty mild. The biggest events in town were the annual rodeo and the Friday night homecoming football game, of course. It was a town full of potluck dinners, block parties, and kids playing tag until the streetlights came on. I don't think I ever appreciated just how ordinary and safe it all seemed. At least, not until the night that we lost Sarah. We don't call it the night we lost Sarah, at least back then. It wasn't something people talked about openly. Instead, it lingered, inside whispered conversations and weary glances over the tops of hedges. But I'll get to that. For now, let me just tell you about Sarah herself. Her house was 2 streets over from mine, nestled on the corner, where all that rainwater would pool up after a big storm. Obviously, this became a very popular spot for all of us kids to play. Sarah didn't mind. In fact, she encouraged it. It became such a regular habit for all of us to play in that runoff after a big storm. But by the time we got over there, she'd have lemonade and sandwiches already made for us. It was one of those houses that always just seemed brighter than the rest. That white paint never chipped. The garden, God, that garden was like something out of a fairy tale. Lavender and roses in the spring, towering sunflowers in the summer, and every single Halloween her porch would just be crowded with these carved pumpkins, each more intricate than the last. And who can forget every Christmas, the whole house would glitter with lights that she hung up herself, despite her age. She was in her 70s, but she had the energy and coherence of somebody much younger than that. Sarah wasn't just the nice old lady on the corner, she was the heart of our neighborhood. She'd been widowed a few years prior, and she could have retreated into her grief, but instead she poured herself inside the community. She would organize bake sales, taught kids how to plant tomatoes, and still would find time to swim laps at the YMCA every single week. My mom would always call her unstoppable, and honestly, I think that's how everybody saw her. I was 14 when it all happened. It was really late outside. Only sounds that I could hear from my bedroom at the time were the occasional chirp of the crickets. Of course, that low hum of a neighbor's air conditioner. When the sirens started, they all came at once. A wall of noise that seemed to rise and slam into the house like a tidal wave. I sat bolt right up in bed, heart immediately hammering in my chest. Sirens at this hour was very uncommon, and sirens that close, totally distressing and very weird. Next came the glow, a flickering orange that danced against my walls. I scrambled to the window and pressed my face to the glass. From my room, I could just make out the plume of smoke curling up into the night sky, thick and black. Holy shit, there was a house on fire. I wiped the sleep from my eyes and tried to make out which home it actually was. But with the angle and the darkness outside, and plus my sleep-deprived kid brain, I couldn't exactly tell. "Go back to bed," my dad told me when I crept downstairs to see what was going on. His face was pale and he looked really nervous. "It's just a fire. It's under control though." "Whose house is it?" "Sarah's." I went numb. "It's just a fire. I'm sure she's fine." But I could see the fear in his eyes. Even then, I knew something more was up. They let me stay downstairs for a little bit more, and sure enough, dozens more emergency vehicles were quickly on the scene. Fire engine after fire engine, other fire trucks, ambulances, police. All we truly hoped was that Sarah was now out of the house and hopefully being treated by the EMTs. We didn't really care what else happened. I floated out the idea of walking over, but my parents did not want to get in the way of all the first responders. Eventually, they told me I really had to go back to bed now. By the time I woke up the next morning, the fire was out, and the sun had risen on a neighborhood that now felt wrong. It wasn't just the smell, that tang of burnt wood in the air. It was something else that I couldn't quite name. Normally, mornings in our neighborhood were full of life. Lawn sprinklers ticking, cars pulling out of driveways, kids shouting at one another to get to the bus stop. But on that day, I heard none of it. At breakfast, my parents were glued to the TV. The local news showed aerial footage of Sarah's house, or at least what was left of it. The roof had caved in. The second floor was completely gone. Charred beams jutted out like blackened bones. In that garden, her beautiful, vibrant garden, was nothing more than a smoldering patch of earth. Arson, the reporter said grimly. Authorities confirmed that accelerants were used to ignite the blaze. Foul play is suspected. My mom gasped, one hand flying to her mouth, and my dad just shook his head. Sick, twisted world, he muttered, pushing his chair back from the table. I wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Who would do this? Why? But the look on my dad's face immediately stopped me. He was afraid too, and I'd never seen my father that afraid before. We were locking the doors, keeping the porch light on, keeping the counters and tables with the landlines free of call clutter, so we could call 911 if need be. The remaining details came out over the next few days, though I wish they hadn't. It turned out that the fire wasn't meant to cover a robbery. Nothing had been stolen from the house. No, it was something far worse. The fire had been deliberate, calculated attempt to destroy evidence because Sarah hadn't died inside the flames. They found her body in the bedroom, or at least what was left of it. She'd been decapitated. The police wouldn't say much beyond that though, probably to spare the public all the details, or maybe even themselves. But rumors began to spread. Some were saying her hands had been cut off. Others whispered about symbols carved into her skin. Whether any of that was true or not, I don't know. What I do know is this though. The person who did this wasn't just a murderer. There was something far darker, something worse. Sarah was literally the sweetest, kindest person inside our neighborhood. To be able to kill her was beyond any sin imaginable. For weeks, the neighborhood was just still in this dormant state of shock. People triple locked their doors, installed floodlights, and started looking at everybody differently. The man who lived across the street from Sarah, a retired teacher named Mr. Donahue, was immediately questioned by the police. So was the teenager who mowed her lawn in the summers, but nothing seemed to come of it. No arrests, no suspects, no answers. Everybody loved her, and it was obvious. I couldn't stop thinking about her. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her smile. The way she used to wave at me when I rode my bike past her house. None of this made sense. Sarah wasn't rich or flashy. She didn't have enemies. She was just good. The kind of good that felt rare even back then. And for no apparent reason, somebody snuffed her out like a candle. No more playing in the puddles by her house. No more sandwiches. No more lemonade. A week after the fire, I biked over to the ruins of her house. A yellow police tape fluttering in the breeze, cordoning off what was left of her property. I stood there for a long while, staring at the blackened shell of her home. It felt wrong to see it like that, stripped of all of its warmth and its life. And that's when I saw something glinting in the dirt near the edge of her garden. Brushing ash and debris aside until I uncovered it. A bracelet. Simple silver with a single charm shaped like a flower. I recognized it almost immediately. Sarah wore it all the time. I shouldn't have taken it, and I knew that even as I slipped it into my pocket, but something about it felt important to me. Like there was a piece of her that had survived, and I couldn't just leave it there, surrounded by ash and ruin. It had clearly fallen off at some point when she was working out there in the garden. Didn't really seem to have any value to anybody else. I began to notice little things after that. The way people acted when Sarah's name came up. The way Mr. Donahue would glance over his shoulder before he spoke, lowering his voice to almost a near whisper. The way my mom and dad would change the subject whenever I brought up the fire. Everybody had their own weird way to deal with the tragedy, and mine was over-observation. I watched what everybody was doing all the time because I knew somebody out there had to be guilty. Somebody knew what happened to Sarah. Then I noticed this man. I happened to see him randomly one night when I glanced out my window. He was standing at the edge of Sarah's property, just outside that police tape. He wasn't from the neighborhood, at least I personally didn't recognize him. His clothes were way too neat and that posture was far too stiff. He didn't belong. Beyond that, he just seemed really tall and really didn't match the description of anybody that lived near us at all. I suppose it was dark and he was pretty far away, but I do have pretty good vision. I watched him from my bedroom window, stomach twisting into knots. He didn't seem to move for what felt like hours, just standing there, staring at the ruins of Sarah's house. And then, almost as if he sensed my gaze, he turned his head slowly. Our eyes met, or at least they almost seemed like they were. He was definitely looking my direction. My bedroom light was on, so it would have been pretty easy to see me. I ducked behind the curtain. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, he was no longer there. I told myself it was nothing, just some random passerby, but deep down, I didn't truly believe that. And when I saw him again the next night, standing in that exact same spot, I knew I wasn't imagining things. That man didn't come back the third night, but his absence did not bring me any comfort. If anything, it just left me with more questions. Who was this man? And why had he been watching Sarah's house? And why did it feel like he'd been watching me too? That said, lots of people made the trip over to Sarah's property, usually more than once. It's the easiest way to pay respect to her, so when I told my parents I saw this weird guy standing by her lawn out in the middle of the night, they quickly dismissed it as just one of her friends, saying his own goodbyes. The neighborhood eventually tried to return to normal, though normal was a word that no longer seemed to fit us. People still mowed their lawns and went to church, but there was hesitation to almost everything, as if the shadow of what happened to Sarah lingered just behind everybody's smiling face. When neighbors passed one another on the street, their nods were a lot stiffer, their waves half-hearted now. The police never made an arrest, and months turned into years. The story faded from the headlines, replaced by fresher tragedies. But Sarah's death hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud that refused to pass. Every Halloween, I couldn't help but think about her jack-o'-lanterns, how they would glow so warmly on her front porch. Every Christmas, I thought about her lights. Her house was a beacon of joy in the cold. Those little things, those symbols of her life were now gone forever, and it felt like the world was a worse place for it. I kept that bracelet, and I told myself it was to remember her by, but the truth was actually a lot more complicated than that. Sometimes I would take it out of the shoebox where I'd hid it and hold it in my hand. It was always cold and heavy, and I would just stare at it until my eyes blurred, hoping it would give me some kind of closure. It was just a bracelet though, a memento. I moved away after high school and went to college, and then built a life far from that little town. I made new friends, started a real career, and did my best to forget the things that I couldn't change. But forgetting isn't the same as healing, and no matter how far I went, that memory of Sarah's house, her life and her death, always stayed with me. I visited the home a few times over the years, and the last time I drove past Sarah's old property, there was a new house there. It was a lot smaller and simpler, with a neat little green lawn and no garden. A young family had moved in. They looked happy, and for their sake, I hope they didn't know what had happened there before. There'll be some nights where I dream about her, and in those dreams, she doesn't speak. She doesn't have to. She just looks at me, her eyes full of that same quiet sadness as before. It's not anger and it's not fear, it's something more like acceptance. And yet, I still can't let it go. I still wonder who the hell did that, and I still wonder why. I wonder if the person who took her life still walks free, living their own life, as if Sarah's never mattered. I wonder if they even remember her, or if they've forgotten her completely. I wonder if they still live in that town. If I waved to them good morning, or if I've held the door for them. The police call it a cold case, but to me, it's just a haunting memory. Logging isn't a glamorous job. Nobody grows up dreaming about marking trees for cutting or running a loader up the side of a mountain in the rain. But for me, it was steady work. I got bills to pay, and I actually liked being out in the wilderness. There's a certain peace to it, the quiet hum of the forest and just the way the fog sits low inside those early mornings. It was that peace that made grueling hours easier to take, even when I'm running on 2 cups of gas station coffee and sheer stubbornness. We worked inside a stretch of the Pacific Northwest forest, so far off the beaten path that cell phones were just paperweights in your pocket. It's raw country out there, miles and miles of towering firs and pines, broken up only by the logging roads that wound up into the hills. Most of the time, my day started long before the sun did. I'd load timber into a truck in the pitch black and haul it back up to the city. By the time the first streaks of light painted over the horizon, I'd already be halfway through my first run. It was hard, dirty work, but not complicated, and I liked that. Most days, the biggest danger was falling behind schedule. A late delivery meant the boss might be breathing down your neck, and nobody wanted that. But again, there was a rhythm to it. Once you got into that rhythm, the job just became second nature. I didn't think about much besides the next haul and the next paycheck. Life is simple. I definitely didn't know it at the time, but simple was something that I'd been clearly taking for granted. That season, we were working this particularly remote tract of land. The company had leased it for the better part of 2 years now, but it still felt untouched, wild. I liked it well enough, but some of the guys didn't. They joke about how the woods out there had this bad vibe to it. "It's too damn quiet out here," Mark Wilden said to me more than once. Mark was my usual partner on tree marking days. This wiry guy with a nervous laugh who always had a cigarette tucked behind his ear. Mark and I spent a lot of time together that season, driving the old company truck deep into the forest, marking trees for cutting. It's tedious work, but again, I never minded it. We'd talk about whatever came to mind, sports, movies, the latest gossip from the crew, nothing ever too heavy. And that's what it made so jarring when all of that changed. The work wasn't supposed to be dangerous. Sure, you can get hurt if you weren't paying attention, but the forest itself wasn't supposed to be threatening. It wasn't until we found that car smack in the middle of nowhere that I realized just how wrong I was. It was a normal Wednesday morning, just like any other. Mark and I had been assigned to a tree marking for the day since the rain was supposed to roll in by afternoon, making cutting and hauling too dangerous. So we grabbed that old pickup, a box of neon orange spray paint, and a thermos of coffee, just before heading out into that deepest part of the tract. The trees were thicker out there, towering pines that blocked out most of the light even when the sun was at its highest. You could get turned around real easy in there if you weren't careful. Mark was already in one of his moods. "Feels like it's gonna rain sooner than they're saying," he muttered, lighting a cigarette as I navigated that uneven dirt road. "You ever notice how it's always colder back here too? Like the sun can't even touch it?" I smirked. "You're always coming up with reasons to hate this job, man." He blew out a cloud of smoke and shrugged. "I'm just saying, this part of the woods gives me the creeps." I didn't give him a response. Mark had been harping about the creepy woods all season, and I figured it was just his way of breaking the monotony out. But that day, as we drove deeper into the forest, I felt it too, that prickle at the back of my neck. The truck lurched over a rock and Mark spilled the coffee on himself, cursing underneath his breath. "Hey, stop up there," he said, suddenly pointing. I squinted through the windshield. At first, I didn't see what he was talking about, but as we rolled closer, something metallic caught the light. It was a car, this beat-up old sedan sitting off to the side of the narrow dirt road. "Well, that's weird," I said, pulling over. Mark was climbing out before I even killed the engine. I followed him, my breath puffing out in the chilly air. The car turned out to be deeper into the woods than I really realized at the time. What I thought was just off the road was actually like 60 yards off into the wilderness. We bushwhacked until we reached it. The sedan was in really bad shape. The paint was scorched black and the windows were shattered. The whole thing smelled like smoke and something else. Something sour and sickly, rotten and charred. "How the hell did this even get back here?" Mark muttered, circling the vehicle. "There's no way somebody drove it in. There's no space wide enough." We looked back between the trees and the brush, where we walked in. It was pretty tight. I shook my head. He was right. The sedan was wedged between two massive pines. The narrow dirt track that we'd been driving on didn't even come back here. It didn't make sense. It was almost like it fell out of the sky. But it didn't, I reminded us both. Mark leaned closer to peer inside the driver's side window. "Jesus," he said, stepping back and waving a hand in front of his face. "That smell. Can you smell it?" I nodded, my stomach turning. It was much stronger now. Mark looked at me with that usual smirk he had completely wiped from his face. "You think this might be like a crime thing? You know, like one of those murder dump sites?" Normally I would laugh this off, but those words stuck in my throat. "Maybe," I said finally. "I think we should call this in." I pulled out the company radio and relayed what we'd found. Management said they'd send somebody out, but it would be a while. In the meantime, they told us to stay put and keep an eye on the site. So we waited. Mark paced back and forth, still muttering to himself, while I leaned up against the truck, trying not to think about what actually might be inside that car. But that smell was impossible to ignore. It almost clung to the back of my throat, and the longer I stood there, the more certain I became that something was indeed very wrong. I'd say an hour later, the boss showed up with the brass and another guy that I didn't recognize. Private investigator, maybe? They didn't waste any time. Investigator immediately started poking around, taking pictures and making notes. All the while, my boss asked us to go over exactly what we'd seen. I was halfway through explaining when one of the other guys called out, "Hey, I got the trunk open." Mark and I turned just as he lifted the trunk lid. That smell, that first hit, was a wave of heat and decay that made my eyes water. Mark gagged and doubled over. I just stood there staring. Inside the truck were two bodies, or at least what was left of them. They were burned so badly that it was hard to tell where one ended and where the other began. The flesh was charred black and melted together in places, and the few scraps of clothing that remained were singed beyond recognition. "God almighty," Mark whispered. The investigator closed the trunk quickly, pulled out a handkerchief to cover his nose. "All right, call the cops," he said to the boss. "This is their jurisdiction now." My boss nodded and pulled out his cell phone, glanced over at me and Mark. You two are done for the day. Go back to the main site and just wait there. We'll need statements later, probably have paperwork for you too." We didn't argue. I climbed back into the truck and I gripped the steering wheel a lot tighter than I normally would. Mark was silent beside me, his usual chatter replaced by a heavy, suffocating stillness. No one said a word on that drive back either. I mean, what was there to say? My mind kept replaying that image of the trunk, those blackened bodies, the twisted limbs. Who were they, and how the hell did they end up out here, in the middle of nowhere? Who had done this to them? When we got back to the main site, the other crew members were just standing around, waiting for the news. Word spread fast in a place like this, and by the time the cops arrived, everybody knew what we'd found. The officers ended up questioning us for hours, making us go over every detail again and again. Where exactly was the car? Had we seen anybody else in the area? Did we notice anything strange before that day? But there was nothing to tell them. We found the car and that literally was it. By the time they let us go, it was dark outside. And once again, I drove home in silence, radio off, just stewing in my head. I could barely even sleep that night either. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that trunk. I smelled the smoke and heard the investigator's voice saying, "This is their jurisdiction now." The hell did we walk into? The logging operation shut down the next day. The company cited ongoing investigations, as the reason at least, but nobody needed any official explanation. Everybody knew what happened, and no one wanted to be the next person to stumble across something unspeakable inside those woods. For the next week, the site was swarming with police, crime scene investigators, and even a forensics team. They combed that area, searched out that burned out sedan, and questioned the entire crew multiple times. Mark and I had to go back to the station twice to give our official statements, but the truth was, there really wasn't much to tell. The police confirmed what we already suspected. The bodies in the trunk were a man and a woman. They were local, though not from the same community where most of us lived. A young couple newly married, with no known ties to anything criminal, no drugs, no debts, no enemies that anybody could name. They disappeared 4 weeks before we found them. According to the news, their families had reported them missing after they failed to show up for a weekend dinner. Those questions were endless. Why had they been killed and who had done it? And how the hell had a car ended up so deep into the forest, miles from where it should have been? For some reason, one detail that stuck with me was that pile of clothes. They found it maybe 20 yards from the sedan. It was woman's clothing, a few shirts and a pair of jeans, even a dress. Most of it was bloodstained, but it didn't belong to that couple. The police didn't release much information, but somebody on the crew heard from a friend in law enforcement that some of that blood didn't match either of the victims. So there was more victims. At least that's what everybody was thinking, though nobody dared to say it aloud. The forest was reopened after a week or so, but the mood clearly shifted. Those of us who came back to finish out the season couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us out from the trees. Those woods didn't feel like they belonged to us anymore. Every snapping branch, every rustle of the leaves would send my nerves on edge. Even Mark, who usually masked his fear with jokes, was quieter than I'd ever seen him. We never heard about any arrest, and as far as I know, nobody was charged for what happened to that couple. And to my knowledge as well, no other bodies were ever found. The burned out sedan was towed away, and the police packed up and left. But that unease continued to linger. It's been years since that season ended, and I left the logging business not long after. I moved closer to the city where the trees don't feel so heavy and oppressive. But I still think about that car, about the smell of charred flesh and those twisted shapes lying in the trunk. I didn't choose this town by accident. I chose it because it was small, quiet, and miles away from the chaos that I actually grew up in. I was born and raised in the city. It wasn't terrible, it was home, but it wasn't the life that I wanted for my family. When my wife and I were expecting our first child, we started looking for something elsewhere, something different, somewhere safer. That's exactly how we ended up in Millhaven, a tiny dot on the map in the middle of the Midwest. I will say, for the sake of the case and respect for the family, Millhaven is not the real name of the township where this occurred. Millhaven was that quaint kind of town where everybody waved, even if you didn't know them. The school was good, the jobs were steady, and the crime rate was practically non-existent. There were no late-night shootings, no blaring horns at 2 a.m., no random strangers loitering on your front porch. It was perfect, and it was the postcard kind of life that I dreamed about. Our house sat on this quiet cul-de-sac, one of those loops where the kids could ride their bikes in circles all afternoon without you worrying about traffic. Our neighbors were really friendly. You know the sort. People who would bring you casseroles when you moved in and Christmas cookies in December. It was everything we were hoping for, everything that I wanted for my wife and my kids. But there was one exception, the house across the street. When we first moved in, it seemed normal enough. This young couple lived over there, barely out of their 20s, with 2 toddlers who were as loud as they were adorable. They moved in around the same time that we did, and for the first year or two, everything was completely fine, quiet even. The husband, his name was Derek, worked construction, and his wife Amanda stayed home with the kids. We'd wave when we'd see them in the yard, exchange those natural pleasantries at the mailbox, nothing out of the ordinary. But slowly, things began to change. It started out really small like it always does. You'd hear a raised voice here, an argument there. At first it was easy to brush off, every couple fights, right? But those fights didn't stop. They got louder and nastier. Sometimes it was late at night, yelling so fierce it woke up my wife and I out of a dead sleep. Sometimes it happened in the middle of the day. Amanda stood on the porch screaming, while Derek would peel out of the driveway in his pickup truck. It wasn't long before the whole street knew about their business. Derek had a temper, a bad one, and he wasn't shy about showing it. He spent more nights at the bar than he did at home, leaving Amanda to juggle the kids all by herself. And when he was home, it wasn't much better. We'd hear him shouting, slamming doors, throwing things. We all try to stay out of it. You don't really want to meddle in somebody else's marriage, not unless you have to. It was super hard not to notice. Harder still when it would get physical. I saw Amanda with a black eye once, trying to hide it behind a pair of oversized sunglasses. She said she walked into a cabinet, and of course, I didn't believe her, but what else could I do? CPS got involved eventually. Someone on the street must have called them. I'm not sure who, but I was glad they did. And for a while, things seemed to calm down. Derek stopped coming around as much, and when he did, he seemed quieter, more subdued. Amanda would bring the kids over to our house for playdates with our youngest. She never really said much about what was going on, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Still, for all the drama, for all the noise and chaos, none of us could have predicted what was coming. We thought we'd seen the worst of it, and we were very wrong. It was a little after 3 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of screaming. Not that usual shouting or slamming of doors. It had become so common now across the street. This was different. This was raw and panicked, and so shrill it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand straight up. For a brief moment I thought I was dreaming. My wife stirred next to me, mumbling something incoherent before rolling over. But the screaming outside didn't stop. I climbed out of bed and moved to the window. From the soft glow of the streetlights, I could see Amanda standing on her front lawn, barefoot and disheveled. She was clutching her phone in one hand, the other hand pulling at her hair like she was trying to tear it out by the roots. "Derek," she was shouting. "The kids, oh God, the kids." Her voice cracked in that last word. It hit me like a punch to the chest. I grabbed my robe and ran downstairs, throwing open the front door before my brain could catch up to my body. When I stepped outside, the cold air stung my face, but Amanda's screaming drowned out everything else. She was pacing in frantic circles now, her phone pressed to her ear. I could hear snippets of her conversation with the dispatcher, something about Derek, the truck, and the kids, but none of it was making sense yet. "Amanda!" I called out, stepping off the porch. She spun to face me, her eyes were wide and wild. "Stay away!" she screamed, pointing at me like I was the one who'd done something. "Just stay away!" I froze mid-step, my hands raised in surrender. "I'm just trying to help you," I said. But clearly she didn't want my help. She didn't want anybody's help. She turned from me and kept screaming into the phone, her words slurring together in a tangled mess of panic and despair. By the time the police got there, Amanda was on her knees in the grass, sobbing so hard she could barely even breathe. Both officers approached her cautiously, one kneeling down to speak to her while the other looked around the yard. I watched from my porch, feeling useless and intrusive. Eventually, more squad cars pulled up, their red and blue lights painting the cul-de-sac in these dizzying patterns. I could see the officers going in and out of Amanda's house, talking to each other in these low, urgent voices. Amanda remained on the lawn, now wrapped up in a blanket somebody had brought out for her. I wanted to go over and ask what was going on, but I just stayed put. Something about the scene felt wrong, almost like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, teetering dangerously close to the edge. When the sun came up, the whole street was buzzing with speculation. Neighbors had gathered up in small clusters, trading theories and whispering rumors. I didn't join them. Instead, I just remained on my porch, sipping coffee and staring at Amanda's house, waiting for the real answers that never came. Later that morning, one of the officers came over to talk to me. He was this stocky guy with a buzz cut and a serious face. "Sir," he said, pulling out a small notepad, "did you hear or see anything unusual last night?" I told him what I knew, the screaming, Amanda on the lawn, and the chaos that followed. He just nodded and jotted down notes as we spoke. "Do you know Derek personally?" he asked. I hesitated. "Not well," I admitted. He kept to himself most of the time. Amanda was the one that we talked to a lot more often. The officer frowned, tapping his pen against the notepad. When's the last time you saw him?" I thought back. A few days ago maybe. He'd been in and out a lot lately though. Spends most of his time down at the bar downtown. The officer thanked me and moved on to the next house. I sat there, coffee growing cold in my hands, trying to piece together what really had taken place. The official story came out later that evening. Amanda and Derek had gotten into another fight, but this time Derek hadn't just stormed out to cool off. He waited for Amanda to fall asleep, packed up the kids and left in the middle of the night. No note, no explanation, just gone. The police found a blurry security camera clip from an intersection a few miles outside of town. It showed Derek's truck, the taillights disappearing into the darkness, and that was really it. Nobody had seen him or the kids since. Amanda was obviously inconsolable. She spent days pacing her front yard, shouting into her phone, begging anybody who would listen for help. The police did their best, putting out an Amber Alert for the kids and a warrant for Derek, but none of it seemed to matter. He'd vanished, like smoke on the wind. Neighbors stopped lingering outside. Kids stopped playing inside that cul-de-sac. Everybody seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing ever did. Days turned into weeks and then weeks into months. The truck never returned. The kids never returned. And Derek never turned back up either. And that's when the rumors started. Some people thought Derek had snapped, that he'd hurt the kids and then gone on the run. Others thought he might have started a new life somewhere far away. A few even whispered that Amanda might have actually had something to do with it, though no one dared say it to her face. Personally, I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that every time I looked at that house across the street, a knot would form in my stomach. A creeping dread would soon follow. Months would pass, but the unease never did. Amanda stayed in that house, a ghost of herself, haunting the windows and porch like she was waiting for something or someone to finally come home. She wouldn't even make eye contact with anyone anymore. She wouldn't speak to the neighbors. She was now just existing, this thin and hollow form. It felt like the whole town wanted to move on, but that mystery just wouldn't let us. Every now and again, somebody would bring it back up, the truck and the kids. But the conversation always ended the same way. with an uncomfortable silence and averted eyes. One night, months after the disappearance, I stepped out onto my porch for some fresh air. The cicadas were buzzing off in the distance. Across the street, Amanda's house was dark, except for a faint glow in the living room. I was about to head back inside when I saw something, movement in her front yard. At first I thought it was Amanda, but then I realized the figure was far too fast. It darted through the shadows, pausing near the flower bed beneath the front window. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was actually seeing. It looked like a child. No, a man crouched low behind a bush. Was he trying to hide, and what was he doing? "Hey!" I called out, and I don't really know why I did. The guy's head snapped up, and for a brief moment, I caught sight of him. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. It was the way he was looking at me, almost like he knew me, like he wanted something from me. Damn, it caught me so off guard I thought I was gonna piss my pants. But then just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone, bolting across the yard and disappearing around the side of the house. It's almost like he was looking for something inside that flower bed and got caught and then made a mad dash to get away. I didn't sleep that night. I told myself I just imagined it all, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew better. The next morning, Amanda was gone. Her car was still in the driveway, but there was no signs of a struggle. The house was completely empty. No note, no explanation, just like Derek and the kids. Eventually, the police came again, combing through her house and questioning the neighbors, but no one saw anything. Nobody heard anything. Her front door was wide open and there was no sign of the lady, like she just walked off into the countryside. I didn't tell them about the guy, at least not at first. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding completely batshit. Eventually, I fessed up to my wife and we made a report with the police. They were still just as disillusioned as I was, though. After Amanda disappeared, the rumors began up again, ugly and more desperate this time. Some people were thinking that she finally snapped, driven mad by grief and guilt. Others thought that Derek had come back for her, maybe to silence her for good. There were also some that believed that Amanda was having an affair. Perhaps her lover had now gotten involved. But I couldn't stop thinking about that guy that I saw in the middle of the night. A few weeks later, I actually woke up to the sound of sirens, and the smell hit me before I could even make it to the porch. A sickly stench that clung to the air. Amanda's house was on fire. The flames tore through it like a living thing, devouring the walls and windows with a ferocity that didn't even seem natural. The firefighters worked through the night, but by morning, there wasn't much left. Somebody said it was by accident, faulty wiring, but I didn't believe that. I stood on my porch staring at the charred skeleton in that house and felt that cold, creeping dread settle over me once more. Later on that year, the new owners started clearing out the lot. They brought in big crews to dig up the foundation and haul away the rubble, make way for something new. And that's when they found the bodies, buried in the crawl space, wrapped in plastic and duct tape. Amanda's children and Derek. The official story was messy and incomplete. Maybe Derek had come back that night. Maybe Amanda snapped and had done it herself. They didn't know. But at that point, nobody cared. The rumors continued of a secret affair. Perhaps Amanda's lover had gone too far, and she couldn't live with the guilt anymore. That creeped me out because of the guy that I saw that night. And to this day, I have no idea who they were or if they were even involved.